But wonderful story. Sri Ramanujacharya lived to be, I believe, 120 years old. He had an amazing life, truly amazing from beginning to end. And his contributions were many. What was wonderful about him was that he personified precisely what it means to be a perfect Vedantin, a perfect follower of Vedanta, in that, on the one hand, he was the most amazing philosopher. When it came to philosophy in the strict sense of that term, the strictest sense of that term, he was a scholar. He wrote many works of tremendous philosophical importance. On the other hand, when he wasn't writing, he spent all of his time doing devotional activities, serving the deity, the Murti in the temple. You know, he lived as a priest. He lived toward the end at Srirangam, which is a very sacred city, very important city in South India, Tamil Nadu. And what was wonderful about him is that, again, primarily, as brilliant as he was intellectually, he was a bhakta. He lived to, in silence, quietly, serve the deity, wash the temple, do puja, to actually do, not just think. So he was this perfect combination of both jnani and bhakta, both. And that's what we're meant to be. We're meant to be philosophical in the true sense of that term. We're meant to be wise, but also we have to put that wisdom to practice. And what is that practice? That practice is to love God. You've heard me quote St. Augustine before, verus philosophus est amator Dei, in Latin, that the greatest philosopher is the lover of God. One of my favorite sayings of Augustine. So Ramanuja personified that in every way. So with that, I wanted to discuss just a little bit 4 of the most important verses of Bhagavad Gita. I only discussed this once, to my knowledge, in Milwaukee when I was at when I gave a talk at the Hindu temple there. I gave an hour and a half long talk on these 4 verses. So I haven't, to my knowledge, to my memory, discussed this here in Omaha in the past. But there are 4 verses, what are called the Chatur Shloki, that are considered to be very, very important verses, and they come sequentially, one after the other. These are verses, chapter 10, verse 8, 9, 10, and 11. So we'll discuss these verses a little bit, not for very long, because we want to do bhajan, which is just as important. All right? So with that, if anyone has a Bhagavad Gita, feel free to follow along. We'll begin with this first verse, which again is chapter 10, verse 8. And I'll skip the Sanskrit, I'll just do the English. So this is Bhagavan Sri Krishna speaking. He says, I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds. Everything emanates from me. The wise who know this perfectly engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts. So this verse is by itself an extremely important verse, actually. This is a verse which, using my process of exegetical analysis, what I call exegetical analysis, that is truly understanding the nature of these verses in Scripture. This is what I call both an ontological but also a soteriological verse. Okay, and I'll explain what I mean by this. In the first section of this verse, Bhagavan Sri Krishna is explaining what is his own nature. Thus, it is an ontological verse. He is describing his own being. To me at least, these are always the most important verses, where God is describing himself. Because everything else we can learn relatively easy. We can learn about ourselves. And I say relatively. Of course, self-realization is not that easy. But relatively easy in comparison to knowing the divine. The deepest nature of God. We can know everything around us. Again, we can know everything relatively easy. But when it comes to God's inner nature, that's more difficult. So these verses are especially important. So let's just unpack this a little bit. I am the source of all spiritual material worlds. Well, number one, is there anything else outside of the spiritual material? No, that's everything. So what he is saying is he is the source of all reality. You know, what is meant by the source? First of all, what is meant by the source? Everything has a cause. Everything that exists in this sequential relationship of cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. Everything that exists is an effect that had a cause that created it, And again, it's a sequence that just goes on for some time. Well, of course, what Krishna is saying here is that he is Karana Karanam. He is the cause of all causes. Karana Karanam. Quite literally, Karana means cause. He is the cause of all causes. So, if we were to trace this causality, this cause and effect, back to what is the ultimate cause, that which has no cause itself, that is Bhagavan Sri Krishna, that is God. So that's what he's saying here. He is confirming this. And this is very important. In this verse, especially if you do look at the Sanskrit, very important. Aham. He says aham. Aham sarvasya prabhavo. Aham. Aham means I. He uses the first person pronoun again and again in this. He is not talking about someone else. He's not talking about merely an impersonal Brahman who he happens to be representing. He is speaking of himself, you see. This is common language in every language. It's so common, it's so universal to the point where there's no language in which this simple I am, it does not exist. It exists everywhere. If I say, I want a glass of water, do I mean that that person wants a glass of water? Do I mean that George Washington, some person in history, wanted a glass of water? No. It's very clear and straightforward. I, the individual who is making the pronouncement, desires a glass of water. Now, why am I making such a big deal about this? The reason why is because, unfortunately, in the 20th century specifically, there were some very unknowledgeable commentators who tried to explain in their own way that when Bhagavan Sri Krishna is speaking of himself as God, well, he's not really talking about himself. He's talking about God as God is expressed through him, or he's talking in the more abstract or metaphorically, etc., etc. There is, within the context of the text, the Bhagavad Gita, zero evidence that that is the case. Zero evidence that that is the case. Krishna's words are extremely straightforward. So when he says, Aham sarvasya prabhavo, when he says this, Aham, I am the source of all spiritual and material worlds and realities, he is saying that he is God. He is saying, Bhagavan Sri Krishna is saying that he is the divine. So, let's go on to the next clause. Everything emanates from me. Everything emanates from me. Now, it's interesting. If we compare this sentence to the previous sentence, don't they sound like they're basically saying the same thing? I am the source, so everything emanates from me. They sound similar, but they're not. There is a distinction between the two. Again, as we've seen, God uses an economy of words. He doesn't just kind of throw words out for fun. What does he mean by this second verse? Well, simply because you are the source of everything does not necessarily mean that all things cannot have their existence without you. So in other words, with this second verse, he is saying, not only am I the source of all things, but in fact, they come from my nature. They proceed from my nature. So really, what he's saying in a way is, there is nothing but me, and that which emanates from me. Okay? So we've talked about this in the past. God's energies, all of God's energies, come from God, but at the same time they are distinct from God. Okay? We, living beings, for example, are Tatashta Shakti. The Atmans, unlimited numbers of Atmans. We are one of those energies of the divine, emanating from the divine, in this sense, non-distinct from the divine. Okay? So the first sentence, God is our source. But more than this, with the second sentence, there is nothing without God. Really, in a way, all that there is God and that which proceeds from God, and is thus same as God, but also distinct from God. All right, let's go on. And this clause is very important. This is the soteriological clause. This is the salvation clause here. The wise who know this perfectly, what was just spoken of, engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts. So those individuals who are wise, and how are they wise? By knowing what is the true nature of the divine. Because if we don't know this, can we truly have wisdom? Wisdom does not come from the bottom up. It comes from knowing that thing which, once you know it, you know everything. And again, because why? God being the source. If you know the source, you know all that which proceeds from the source. Okay? The wise who know this, what do? Do they simply revel in their wisdom? They do something with their wisdom. Remember what I was just speaking about with Ramanuja. He had jnana, he had knowledge. He was a philosopher, but then he proceeded with action. He did something with that, and not just any action, bhakti, devotion. This is exactly what this clause is saying. Amazing, isn't it? Exactly what this clause is saying. Let me just read it again. The wise who know this. So again, Krishna is saying, for those individuals who are already wise, they already understand the nature of reality. Do they simply stop there? No. Those individuals now perfectly engage in my devotional service and worship me with all their hearts. So this is why, again, wisdom is the beginning of spiritual enlightenment. And then we engage in bhakti. All right, powerful verse. Let's go on to the next verse. And again, this is chapter 10, verse 9 now. And I'll skip the Sanskrit again. The thoughts of my devotees dwell in me. Their lives are surrendered to me, and they derive great satisfaction and bliss enlightening one another and conversing about me. Very joyful verse. This is satsanga, is it not? This is what it means to engage in association with other devotees and to enliven one another. This is what Krishna is saying here. So this is, we could say, a sadhana verse, a verse that explains practice, that explains upaya, what is the actual practice. So first he explains what is his own nature. He explains how important it is to understand what is the nature of God, and that to understand this means not just through the intellect, but through devotion. But now he goes on. He explains now what is the process by which we understand, and what is the process by which we increase our bhakti. So the thoughts of my pure devotees dwell in me. What does this mean? Well, we try always to think about God. We try to meditate upon God. Even at times when it seems that we're not meditating and we're just doing our daily activities, our thoughts dwell upon God. We're always thinking about something spiritual, and it doesn't, need to be quite literally that we have, Krishna envisioned before us with everything that we're doing. It doesn't have to be directly Krishna. But let's say we're thinking about spiritual things, or, we think of our guru, or just anything even related to God. In this way, God is present. Okay? Their lives are surrendered to me. So in every way, we are engaging in the process of increasing our surrender more and more and more to the divine. And this part is very nice. And they derive great satisfaction and bliss, enlightening one another and conversing about me. Satisfaction and bliss. Do we need anything more? Who here does not want satisfaction and bliss? Raise your hand. This is what everyone wants. And Krishna is explaining that in doing such things as this, in discussing God, in having puja, in doing spiritual things, we enliven one another by discussing these things with one another. In this process is a very interesting dynamic of two seemingly opposing ideas. On the one hand, really, it's a lonely process because only we know what's in our heart. You know, only we, when we're meditating, have to struggle with our mind. Someone else sitting next to us can't help us with that. We have to do it. So in a way, we are alone much of the time, but at the same time, we're not. Because conversely, we are also meant to have this satsanga. We are also meant to be in the company of other individuals who are like-minded. And in this way, we encourage them and they encourage us, you know. You know, there were especially, this is true among some yogis as well, that you had some hermits, but this was also true in early Christianity. You had the Desert Fathers. I don't know if anyone's heard of these people, the Desert Fathers. These were some monks in the very early centuries, basically first to around the 5th century of Christianity. And they took vows to be absolutely alone, and I mean alone. And these were absolute hermits. They would go into the desert, they would have a little dwelling, and they would take a vow to never see or speak to another human being for the rest of their life. And they would just stay there and just pray and study the scripture. Quite a few of them went crazy. You know, some didn't, many didn't, but a few did. Why? This is not a natural process. We are meant to have the association of others, you see. And the very fact that they, even in their isolation, were attempting to have the association of God shows that association is something that we need. See, even these monks were seeking association, but with the divine, with God. So truthfully, they went too far. We are meant to have our times when we're alone, in isolation, contemplation, where we have our own spiritual time, but then we have to have times like this when we are with other people and we inspire each other. All right. Let's go on now to chapter 10, verse 10. To those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, I give the understanding by which they come to me. This is an epistemological verse. This is a verse in which what is described is how we can know God. Okay, so let's go over this just quickly, because it's pretty self-explanatory. It's not much to say, but still. Number one, to those who are devoted, who are constantly devoted and worship me with love. Again, that is the path. That is the process by which we can know the divine. I give the understanding by which they come to me. That part is actually very crucial. That part is crucial. And very quickly, let me explain why. When it comes to we as knowers attempting to acquire knowledge, we tend to think that the only two factors are indeed we as the knower and then that object of knowledge. And that's it. That's it. You know, I am the knower. I want to know what time it is. I will look at that object, the watch. Really, time is the object. And I now know time. When it comes to spiritual knowledge, however, there is the third factor that's there that Krishna is speaking of here, himself. There is God, who is also a factor. And in actuality, while indeed effort is necessary on our part to know the divine, ultimately it's the grace of the divine by which we know the divine. So again, this interesting balance. Some people will say it's one or the other. Some people will say the way that we know the divine is absolutely through our own efforts alone. You know, if I'm just really smart and I really study hard and I read all the scriptures of the world and I meditate and I do and I do and I do, eventually I will earn this knowledge. Okay? There's that party that thinks that. Then conversely, there are those individuals who feel that no, there's nothing that we can do. We are so lowly, we are so powerless, we are so finite that ultimately nothing that I do, ultimately, even spiritually, really has any meaning, because ultimately all that matters is God's grace. And all that I can do is just sit there, open myself to God's grace, and wait for everything to be revealed to me. Well, that's another extreme. Both extremes, of course, are wrong. In actuality, what we are meant to do, and in this sequence, is everything in our power to know the divine. everything, everything, everything. Use every hair follicle that we have. Use everything. Use our intellect, use our mind, use our body, use our everything in order to know that divine. But then ultimately, when that knowledge comes, we understand that it has come to us as the direct grace of God. You see. Really, what we're doing by all that work previously is making ourselves worthy vessels. And then once we are a worthy vessel, that knowledge simply flows through us effortlessly. And that's the grace. That is the grace. So, one more verse we will do. And this is again chapter 10 and verse 11. Out of compassion for them, I, dwelling in their hearts, destroy with the shining lamp of knowledge the darkness born of ignorance. This is a very powerful, very beautiful verse. It's really a continuation of the previous verse, so this is an epistemological verse, but much clearer, much clearer, just expressed in a very, very beautiful way, and confirming what we were just talking about. That ultimately it is God who is responsible for our knowledge. Again, we can study all that we want. It's an interesting thing. You've heard me say this before. I know so many professors of religious studies, some of who have read Bhagavad Gita, all these various Vedic works for 20, 30 years, 40 years. So many of them I know. And yet, of course, they have no spiritual inkling to them whatsoever. Nice people, some of them are quite nice people. But as far as their goal being to know God by the study of these scriptures, by the study of Sanskrit, etc., doesn't exist within them. These people do not have the grace of the divine. Why? They never sought it. They do not seek it. Thus, they do not open themselves to it. You've heard me say this before. Is there ever a time when we are not surrounded by the grace of God? No. We're always surrounded by God's grace. But what do we need to do? Open ourselves. That's it. Open ourselves. And it's an amazing thing. We can be radically qualified in every other way imaginable. We can be good looking. We can be very educated. We can have studied all the philosophy of the world. We can even have studied Sanskrit. We can even have read the Bhagavad Gita 100 times. We can have wealth. We can have just so many good qualities. But if we close ourselves to the grace of the divine, we will not know the divine. And we've witnessed this so many times. And yet conversely, when we open ourselves, then we know the divine. Then that grace is there, operative within us. This is what makes it operative, is to open ourselves. How do we open? Question, how do we open? How do we open ourselves to that grace?
Surrender, bhakti.
Yes, surrender, bhakti, prapatti, surrender. Very simple. That's it. Very beautiful analogy that's given here. The shining lamp of knowledge. Let me just read this again. Out of compassion for them. So again, it is Bhagavan Sri Krishna, it is God who is opening this knowledge to us. And why? Out of compassion, out of love. Because he sees that we're suffering. Out of compassion for them, I, God, dwelling in their hearts, destroy with the shining lamp of knowledge the darkness that is born of ignorance. Those who are not aware of God's grace, who are not aware of God's presence, are in ignorance. We have blinders on. We have blinders on. Spiritually speaking, it's as if our senses have become dulled and inoperative. You know, our buddhi, our wisdom faculty, has become inoperative. Our ability to penetrate reality and to understand reality has become inoperative. Of course, it has become inoperative because we have chosen to make it inoperative. You know, so Bhagavan Sri Krishna dwelling within our hearts out of love, out of compassion for us, once we have shown ourselves to Him, once we have proven ourselves to Him, once we have made ourselves into worthy vessels by our own action, by our own practice, what does He do? He becomes like a light within our very hearts. This is a beautiful, just a beautiful thing to envision, that this knowledge, which is actually non-different from God, is a shining lamp. You know, when we do the puja and we offer the little lamp, this is why this lamp is so significant, symbolically. This is why in all of Sanatana Dharma you'll have the Deepa in so many different instances. This is why you have Trataka. You even have a meditation where you literally will meditate upon that lamp. You know? This is why we find this lamp again and again and again mentioned throughout the scriptures, because it is the natural light of knowledge that is there already within us. So, by the grace of Bhagavan Sri Krishna, we know this. Very good. Bhagavan Sri Krishna ki jai.